Bonjour. Welcome everyone to the Capacity Building Center for Tribes. My name is Jackie Croshoe and I'm enrolled in the Turtle Mountain Band in North Dakota and happy to be here today. And I thank all of you for coming and joining us. So as participants are signing in here, I just would love it if you could take a second and type your name and title into the chat room or tribe that you are with. And I also want to take a quick second to introduce my wonderful colleague, Esther Ann, who's with me here today, and she will help us monitor that chat room. So as
go ahead.
You
do that now. Do you want me to do that now, Jackie?
Absolutely.
Okay, hi, sorry. My name is Esther Ann, like Jackie said. We're colleagues at the Capacity Building Center for Tribes. I am from Maine. I'm a member of the Passamaquoddy tribe, and I'm so excited to be, I've been able to be at every one of these, so I'm so glad to be here again today. Welcome, everyone.
Good, thank you for that. I see folks are still joining, so real quick, I just also want to share with you some of the feedback that we've received from last week's Part 2 webinar. And someone wrote, one of the things they talked about was just how appreciative they were of the clear considerations and just the repetition on the importance of collaboration and communication. Another mentioned that they really liked learning about how the tribes have been able to collaboratively come together in New Mexico for that common goal. So we really appreciate that feedback. So be sure to watch for a link to the evaluation following today's webinar. So let's get started. Today, part 3, we will learn how New Mexico Tribal Indian Child Welfare and New Mexico Partners evolved to draft and pass the Indian Family Protections Act to build stronger ICWA protections in New Mexico. So I'm excited to hear about this because I recognize that a lot of tribes and states who do not have higher standards are really interested in looking into how they can protect their native families. So because we have an hour, I want to get started and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jacqueline. If you could introduce yourselves as well as the other presenters.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jacqueline Yalch from the Pueblo of Isleta. I serve as the Social Services Director, and I am the current president of the New Mexico Tribal Indian Child Welfare Consortium. With me, I have my two awesome sisters. I have Julie Bird and Donalyn Sarracino, who will introduce themselves.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julie Bird. I serve the Pueblo of Nambe. I represent them as their ICWA manager. I am an enrolled member of Okeawinge, and I reside there in Okeawinge. So welcome, everyone, and thank you for allowing me to share space with you today and have a really meaningful discussion on ICWA. So thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Donalyn Sarracino, and I'm the director for the Office of Tribal Affairs with New Mexico Children, Youth, and Families Department, Office of the Secretary. I am also from the Pueblo of Acoma. I too appreciate being able to be here with you all again for a third time and allowing us to share space and share what we have come to know so far. And I hope it's very useful information for all of you to help everyone as we continue to build and grow for the benefit of all of our tribal children and tribal communities across the nation. So tawa.
Next slide, please. So I hope you've been able to see the past 2 webinars that we've shared with you in all of the tremendous work that the state of New Mexico tribes have been doing along with our state stakeholders and partners to have something meaningful at the end of the road. And with that, we shared our journey with the frustrations that tribes were challenged with when it comes to ICWA noncompliance. And we also shared our journey of building partnerships, not only amongst ourselves, but with our state partners, especially with those with the New Mexico Children, Youth, and Families Department. We also shared a number of goals and some of our journeys when meeting those goals. One of our major goals that we set out to accomplish, and we successfully did, was the development of a New Mexico State Indian Child Welfare Act. The purpose of this, obviously, was to have something unique to New Mexico. When the consortium began its discussions in 2015 as a whole, it was a shared factor that the issues we were struggling with were supposed to be gold standard. So ICWA was intended to be gold standard. New Mexico tribes wanted something more, and we wanted something more that was meaningful to the impacted families that we were representing and serving in the state of New Mexico. Because of that, we knew that we needed to codify a state ICWA, but also to have a drafting committee and a team that is going to be all inclusive of tribal voices. And when I say tribal voices, this was an entirely led tribal bill for the purpose of meeting the needs of tribal communities in New Mexico. There's always been the practice of laws being pre-drafted, putting into place without any type of input on those who it directly impacts. State of New Mexico changed that, and the state of New Mexico tribes were able to work and hear with our tribal families, our tribal partners, and our stakeholders to see how we were going to be able to begin codifying a state ICWA. We knew our intention was to establish the protection for the best interests of our children, and really bringing out the spirit of ICWA and its true intention, but ensuring that the New Mexico tribal voices are always going to be front and center, and more so front and center for those families and children who were in the state systems. So how we began leading the work, consortium worked with the New Mexico partners, and we identified a number of folks that we knew we could collaborate with. That was, importantly, our tribal leaders. We have to get permission from our leadership to make sure this is something that we can carry out, and get their permission to do so in speaking with them on how it impacts our tribal customs, our laws, and their support as tribal governors. We also wanted to identify and listen to our families within our communities who have some pretty emotional testimonies that they've also expressed they want no other child or family to endure should they ever enter the state system. We also identified working with Bold Futures, who is a nonprofit agency who helped facilitate and coordinate our work group and facilitate these ongoing discussions that we've had as ICWA field workers, tribal leaders, and impacted families. We also worked with the New Mexico Coalition to Stop Violence Against Women, who is also a nonprofit, but had many families that were impacted by a state system. Next slide, please. Okay, Donalyn, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Angela, do you mind go ahead and queuing up the video?
Before 1978, approximately 80% of Native American families living on reservations lost at least one child to the foster care system. Despite these attacks on our families and communities, we have persevered. We are still here. After years of work by impacted families, advocates, and others, the Federal Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA for short, was passed in 1978. Federal ICWA decreased rates of forced family separations and mandated that states honor the sovereign status of Indian nations. But implementation is not often followed through, and Native children continue to be removed from their homes at 2 to 3 times the rate of other children. Today, individuals in states like Texas, Indiana, and Louisiana are currently bringing cases to the Supreme Court to challenge and even dismantle ICWA. Deeply concerned and unsure about the future of federal ICWA, some states like New Mexico are moving to create protections that include and go beyond federal law. Tribal leaders, tribal ICWA workers, advocates, and most importantly, families who have lived the experience of forced separation have come together to craft the Indian Family Protection Act. Together, we will work to pass this legislation in the 2022 New Mexico legislative session. The Indian Family Protection Act recognizes the sovereign rights and self-determination of 23 tribal nations in preserving their cultural lineage through their children while focusing on placing Indian children with their relatives, immediately communicating with tribes when the state receives an investigation on an Indian family, and requiring various supports connecting children to their tribal communities. Native children need our communities. Native communities need our children. Join us in supporting the New Mexico Indian Family Protection Act. Our culture, traditions, and our very lives depend on it.
Thank you, Angela. Next slide, please. What as this journey began, like Jackie mentioned earlier, and we've mentioned in the previous 2 webinars, the journey really began probably in 2015, and even before that, the creation of having a codified version of the Indian Child Welfare Act was always on everyone's mind and agenda and strategic plans. And very early on, like Jacqueline mentioned, we had involvement from tribal leaders, our external stakeholders, the New Mexico Tribal State Judicial Consortium, the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women, Bold Futures, and we were very fortunate that the New Mexico Indian Child Welfare Consortium reached out to include CYFD as part of this process. And the work really began that year of the pandemic, and it was super interesting because everybody went virtual. As you all know, it can be difficult and challenging to be on Zoom meetings. And I remember one particular Zoom meeting where it was literally like 18 hours, right, on Zoom with a whole bunch of partners, tribal leaders, all of our stakeholders, and just because this was so important for everybody and everybody wanted to see this really come to fruition. So the ongoing work was just like, it was just amazing. I cannot go on enough about that. And I think the major things, the way it was really structured was I call the Indian Family Protection Act, or what we call IFPA, as a law of testimony. And so as it's about 157 pages. And so as you really go through each section, there's a testimony from 1 or 2 or half a dozen or all 23 nations, pueblos, and tribes that really tie in and speak the heartbeat of what was happening and what needed to change. And so hearing the testimonies from all of the tribal communities was really important, and really what fueled the creation of the Indian Family Protection Act. I think there are definitely some highlights in that 157 pages, especially around notice, placement preferences, communication and collaboration, cultural supports, training, right? The creation of the Office of Tribal Affairs in Legislative Statute, which we talked about during last week's discussion. But again, I don't want to lose sight that this is why it's so important in my eyes, and you know, I've tried to really communicate this on the state end with the department, is, you know, it's so important to have our tribal partners when involved in the discussions and the process when we're talking about Indian Family Protection Act, because these are their testimonies. These are, this is a way they really came together and said, this has been happening, this can no longer happen, and this is how we're going to change it. And so really, again, each section you can tie, I mean, I'm thinking like the cultural compact section, right, which I refer to as the Nambe section. And so that's really a really important concept to grasp, because we didn't want, the tribes didn't want something to be written for them from individuals who may not be experiencing it. I don't know what it's like across the country in other tribal communities or Indian child welfare practice in other states, but here in New Mexico, our tribal ICWA workers, our tribal ICWA social workers, managers, program directors, more often than not, they're the ones in court. It's not their attorneys, right? It's not attorneys that are representing the tribes on these cases. A lot of the times, I mean, there are some exceptions, right? Every tribe is different, but across the board, it's that tribal ICWA worker who's filing those motions to intervene, who's filing those motions to transfer a case, right? Who's being called as a qualified expert witness. And so to really have that field experience coming in and breathing life to it, it was just amazing. So I'm going to turn it over to Jackie and Julie to see if they have anything to add to that before we kind of get into the meat and potatoes of IFPA.
Thank you, Donalyn. So the effort to begin the legislative drafting process began in 2020 when the core group formed that was primarily consisted of NMTIC and then Navajo Nation ICWA workers and two of our other stakeholders. We started meeting consistently with the tribes to have these ongoing discussions of what was working and not working. So we based all of our conversations on federal ICWA, and we also looked at the BIA guidelines to see what we needed to strengthen and highlight in IFPA. So those conversations began in July of 2020. It was ongoing, and as we were having these conversations, we began drafting. So we began the drafting process during all of these conversations, and when it became time to pull just the core team together, we were able to start filtering everything down into the legal language. When we had a product to go off of, we presented it to the New Mexico partners. We got their feedback. We presented the state ICWA to the 8 Northern Council of Governors. We also went before the All Pueblo Council of Governors, who represents the Pueblos in New Mexico. And then we went before the New Mexico Tribal Judicial Consortium, also got their feedback. So there was a number of folks who were able to look at the draft and provide their expert opinion on maybe some of the more challenging efforts. And then those that were like, holy smokes, like this is great. Why did we not think of that? So as Donalyn mentioned, all of these, the 42 sections that are brand new to IFPA all have a tribe to it. They all have a family face to it. And throughout the whole legislative process, we remembered that. And to carry this bill through when we faced a number of challenges, we faced a number of oppositions from folks who are not supportive of ICWA or IFPA. We also faced some kickbacks in our own state agencies because this meant that there was going to require a huge cultural shift in the way we're going to practice child welfare in the state of New Mexico. So we knew that there was going to be lots of work to be done, but we also knew that we needed to listen to everyone on all sides. More importantly, we needed to stay true to the intent of IFPA and hearing those families and children who truly were suffering while they were in the state systems. So when we started the consultations, which are very different from the ongoing discussions and collaborations that we've had with CYFD and our stakeholders and NMTIC, we were able to get that feedback, and then we continuously changed and updated the draft of IFPA to ensure that it did have an all-inclusive voice of those who were contributing recommendations for improvement of the bill. But more importantly, we wanted to stay true to the customs and traditions that were acceptable to all of the tribal nations in New Mexico, which were the 23 tribal nations. So we wanted to make sure that there was no persuading that would prevent any of the tribal impacts from being eliminated from the bill for the sake of not following through on the state compliance. So again, the accountability, it's strengthened in IFPA because it outlines a number of requirements before a child can even be taken into custody. It outlines a number of things that should be done before a legal proceeding can be filed. And these protections are what the tribes have been voicing since ICWA's establishment in 1978. Is it necessary to remove a child? In more cases than none, it's not necessary. If we are all coming together to provide the work and partner together for better outcomes for the families, and I can testify to this with Isleta, because Isleta has only had 5 ICWA cases in my 15 years working with the Pueblo, because we intervene before these proceedings move forward to a legal filing. And that is the commitment that the tribe has done for our children and our families to ensure that they're given the opportunities for reunifications, but more so given the opportunity to look at the actual safety impacts to determine whether or not a removal is warranted. So again, this law truly centers on the voices and practices of New Mexico tribes and families. Julie.
So I would like to share with you all, as one of the contributors to helping in the development of this bill, coming to the table as a practitioner within a tribal community. I myself, being a member of one of the tribal communities, residing in a tribal community, I'm a little emotional listening to all this now, because I think at moments, we kind of digest what's happened. And then there's other moments in our lives where it's like, holy smokes, like this really did happen, right? But as Jackie has shared, this state ICWA bill, this law, has really afforded me some assurance that if in some future generation of my family or any of my tribal communities, there's these protections that we hope would be honored, that we really spoke out loudly and advocated strongly for in this state of New Mexico, to really afford our tribal nations a spot at the table to really be heard and to really have it coming from what's in the best interest of our tribal children. Who knows our kids better than us, right? And so the contributions we were able to make is that For myself, Nambe Pueblo has had about 8 or 10 ICWA cases in the 4 years I've been working at Nambe Pueblo. When you compare, you know, let's say Isleta to Nambe, there's a drastic difference in population, in location, in resources. And so that, you know, plays a role into how we look at partnering with the state, how we look at our Nambe children and what's being afforded to them, what's being complied with in accordance with the federal law. But what would it look like coming from a state law? And what is it that we've been lacking that we need those supports for our families? And so as a practitioner in Nambe Pueblo, that was some of the contribution and feedback I was able to, you know, share with the core group to afford them some insight on different ways of looking at the particular sections of the law, such as notice, such as investigations, such as preferred placement. Also, like Donalyn had shared earlier, you know, Nambe Pueblo right now, we put in place cultural compacts for any of our children, whether they're in a relative placement or thereof, whether it's a guardianship or something more severe, such as an adoption. The only time we don't put those connections in place is when we reunify, which is the case we want to happen every single time when we advocate for our children. Our goal is reunification. But if at all if at all that doesn't succeed, given everything we can to support our families, we want some type of assurance as a tribe that we want to know where our kids are. And we want our kids to stay connected to who they are as Nambe members in their culture and their heritage, and they get an understanding and the support they need to know where they come from. So I just wanted to kind of throw that in there. I was starting to get a little emotional, but I kind of calm myself down, but thank you for giving me that space.
Great, thanks, Julie and Jackie. We have some poll questions for participants. Angela, can you help us get those? There it is. So one of the questions that we're interested in hearing from participants is if your state has codified a version of the Indian Child Welfare Act into state statute, were your tribes included in that development and establishment of a state ICWA? We'll give folks a few more seconds. Do we have another one or the results of that? Okay, great. It looks like a number of participants, their tribes were included in the establishment and development of a state ICWA. That's awesome to hear. And I believe we may have one more poll question. Does your state have higher ICWA standards or ICWA protections that they expand on what currently exists in the Federal Indian Child Welfare Act? We'll give folks a few more seconds. Angela, do you want to share those results? Wonderful. This is exciting to hear. And I think you know, and having worked with the tribes through this process, that was really important to them, that you know, one of the things that was constantly said is, you know, the Indian Family Protection Act is beyond IFPA, right? And like we had shared, I'm sorry, beyond ICWA, it goes further. And so we had shared previously, Cabinet Secretary Barbara Vigil had shared that IFPA for New Mexico is the platinum standard. And we're just going to share some of the key provisions in IFPA that really that the tribes really felt went beyond IFPA. I'm sorry, beyond ICWA. One of the ones is in regards to notice. And so back in 2016, the department had implemented a practice where tribes would get notice within 24 hours of investigation. And that was great. And we were all excited about it. I still happened to be working on the tribal side in 2016. And so we were really excited about that. And one of the things that we noticed was it wasn't consistent, right? And so there were still situations where tribes were getting notice, you know, a week before a TPR hearing or the day of a TPR hearing, right? And so for tribes here, it was really important for them to have notice, because the tribes, they're very active in their cases and they want to be a part of any safety planning or family-centered meetings, anything that can help prevent that. And if we're not allowing our tribes to participate early on because we're not given notice, it really inhibits their ability to do that. So that was important to get put into IFPA. So now by statute and as of July 1st, we are required to provide, our investigators are required to provide notice within 24 hours. So that's one of the ways that IFPA goes beyond ICWA. There's also a second notice provision, is that if during the investigation, the department says this is a case we're going to file on, we provide the tribes with that second notice, saying these are our active efforts. These are the things we tried that didn't prove successful. This is how we communicated with you or attempted to communicate with you, right? And so IFPA has two additional notice provisions. And there still is that required notice provision at the filing of the petition. Here in New Mexico, it's a Supreme Court approved notice, and we call it the 10-521 form. This is what gets filed with the petition and sent sent to the tribes. So here in New Mexico, there are 3 notices now that tribes should be getting per IFPA as of July 1st. And Julie and Jackie, I want to just turn it over to you to talk a little bit more about that impact that it has in tribes' ability to be able to participate earlier.
Thanks, Donalyn. So this was actually an Isleta practice. This is the section for Isleta, because our relationship with one particular county, we were able to pick up the phone and call, say, hey, we have one of your kiddos. We're going to start that investigation, which was why we've only had 5 ICWA cases. We've carried out that same practice where majority of the workers in our close counties know us. They at least know our phone number, they know to call. And with that, we often do joint investigations, meaning the tribe is accompanying CYFD. So it's transparency work. When we start determining whether or not the family can remain in home with the safety plan, if there is major concern for an immediate removal, we have that joint decision-making capacity where we're being both supportive of not only the agency, but the child itself to make sure that they're not in harm's way with the decision. So with that, we again move forward with any of the collaborative meetings that we have, including the family-centered meetings, creating the plans, sharing both the responsibility of state and tribe to offer resources and services on a collaborative effort. It's really an all-inclusive wraparound plan for the family that has demonstrated to work. So with that, we also have timelines in those plans where we know, and most importantly, the family knows, I need to do these things before a certain time. I know that I need to make changes and they're going to come help me with this. I need to do this. So that's building their own autonomy, but looking at their onus and taking their responsibility for some situations that they may have gotten in, while also mitigating the safety threats. So with that, we don't need to file. And a lot of cases don't result in removals, and they don't result in filing an ICWA case. But that is all because of that early notice and early intervention practices. Julie?
Great, thanks. Thank you, Jackie. The other really important thing in IFPA is regarding membership. And so IFPA membership is determined by the tribe, right? Like as a state agency, we can no longer, and we shouldn't have been able to begin with, right? Because the tribes determine membership, not the state. But in IFPA, it really makes that clear. And so what was happening previously in some of the testimony that was shared from our tribal communities is that, you know, state workers or the state attorneys would go and look up information on what it is to be enrolled member, right? And so based on their research on the internet, if they determined the child wasn't eligible for enrollment, then they would say, okay, it's not an IFPA case, we don't need to notify the tribe. So IFPA put a stop to that because here in New Mexico, a lot of tribes, membership is defined more broadly, and it's really tied to custom and tradition. So enrollment is one form of membership. It's not the only form of membership. And in the discussions and hearing some of the testimony, so okay, great, thank you. So it really put a stop to that. We're hoping it puts a stop to that, right? Because that's the sovereign right of the tribe. And so, you know, children, members, custom and tradition, right? We have family members. I have family members who, you know, have chosen not to become enrolled members. That doesn't mean they're not a member of our tribe, right? Like, and so really taking that and putting that responsibility on the tribe, that's their right to be able to determine that. Jackie or Julie, do you have anything to add to the membership?
So with regards to membership, I think that that's been a interesting discussion, not only possibly on the state side, but as well for us on the tribal side. A lot of our tribal leaders, you know, have somewhat of a framework of what ICWA is, but now we're really digging into really figuring out how that really truly applies to us as tribal communities and sovereign nations. And so when this came up in the Indian Family Protection Act, it was also a way to educate and help our tribal leaders to really view membership possibly in a whole different light other than enrollment. And so it really afforded us as tribal practitioners the opportunity to work side by side with our tribal leaders in looking at some other avenues of the Indian Family Protection Act, as well as the Indian Child Welfare Act. And we also were able to utilize the 2019 guidelines passed with BIA to kind of help lead those discussions and really just expand our thought process on what does membership look like for us as a tribal community. Because we do recognize that in some communities, you know, there may be 10, 12 steps ahead in identifying that discussion or possibly already having processed that discussion. But then you find some other tribal communities where, you know, it really challenges the thought process in terms of looking and evaluating, like, what do we think traditional and what do we think on, you know, as an administration. And so it really afforded us some really interesting dialogue and helpful information to really dig in deep to find out and challenge the tribe, like, how do we really see our members? So I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
One of the things, just one last thing on the membership. I was fortunate enough to serve during Governor Kurt Riley's administration when he was at the Pueblo of Acoma. And one of the things that, you know, he talked about all the time was, you know, just because a child is not enrolled doesn't mean they're not a part of who we are, right? And it doesn't mean that there's not a grandparent or an auntie or an extended relative that we can work with. And it doesn't mean that it's not an opportunity to grow into who they are and understand. Blood quantum has nothing to do with that, right? Like one of our young people I heard say, and it just always stuck with me, in that I am not going to let a foreign government issued piece of paper tell me who I am or tell me where I belong. And I get shaky and choked up and that those words never left my mind. And so under Governor Riley's administration, that was something that was really important at the time for the tribe to really, like Jackie and like Julie mentioned, to really take stock in how we as tribal communities bring our children home, right? And really be able to breathe what ICWA was established to do. One of the other really big key provisions in IFPA is regarding placement preferences. So in placement preferences, it limited placement preferences. So in IFPA, there's only 3, whereas in ICWA, there's 4, right? And it did that for one really important reason, in that, and not because we don't recognize, not because the tribes didn't recognize that there are children and situations and youth who may need a higher level of care, like treatment foster care or residential settings, right? Things of that sort. But we didn't want Native children getting lost in those systems. So in New Mexico, in early 2021, in March, April 2021, we started a procedure that we call out of preferred placement reviews. And this, when a child is in out of preferred ICWA placement, every 30 days, we as an agency are required to staff the case and move the child into a preferred placement. And so, again, the placement preferences, you know, under IFPA are family, right? Another family from the child's tribe, and then another tribal family. And so anytime placement preferences don't fit what it says in IFPA, or the tribes, right? The tribe can tell us our placement preferences differ in this way, and this is who we, this is what we consider placement preferences. We have to follow that. And if we're not following what the tribes have established as their placement preferences or IFPA's placement preferences, it initiates these out of preferred placement staffings to happen. Jackie and Julie, do you have anything to add in regards to the out of preferred placement staffings?
I think in my experience, they've been extremely helpful and beneficial for identified family who were not being considered as possible placements. I think at those meetings, it's times when the tribes are truly advocating for the best interest of the child, because what the state may identify as a safety threat or a reason not to license that relative placement, they're not extreme. But if they're being identified as a barrier for licensing, what is the plan to help the family eliminate that barrier? So that's the purpose of these conversations that we have during the out of preferred placement meetings, to make sure that the identified issues for the family that's been identified as a placement are not a lingering barrier for this child to be with family. And that's key. And that's also key for the priority of placement preferences. The intent of ICWA and IFPA is not only cultural connections and having that participation, it's family. It doesn't mean because a child has to be removed and placed in placement, it doesn't eliminate the family that they have. It doesn't give anyone the right to place a child in an alternative family that is not their own. And we are extremely grateful to resource families, foster families, for opening their hearts and homes to all children. But all children also have extended families, and these biological families deserve that opportunity and right to maintain those relationships with their children.
And so I look at out of home preferred placement meetings as the rainbow in the storm for Nambe Pueblo. You know, being a tribal practitioner, we're not familiar with everything, all the trinkets and mechanisms that make up CYFD with New Mexico. So, you know, what we found to be very helpful and beneficial for us using OOPPs is that we were able to access supportive services for our children. We were also able to identify that maybe there was a lack of active efforts provided to our children and their families. You know, when homes were identified within either our tribal communities or with relatives, you know, there was a lot of resistance from the CYFD itself in making those transitions happen from a foster home where one of our kids was immediately placed to taking several months to transition them to a relative home. And we found ourselves in a situation where we were facing a lot of opposition in helping that transition occur for the best interests of our child. And so when OOPPs came into play, that was the mechanism that afforded us the necessary supports in order for that transition to occur for one of our kiddos. And so I always look at OOPPs as the teacher in the classroom with the ruler and making sure we're doing all our work that's either in class or our homework assignment, because you know, we all have to be accountable for the best interests of our tribal children. And so that's how I see OOPPs working with Nambe Pueblo. So thank you.
Thank you, Julie and Jackie. One of the things just on OOPPs to really quickly is that we work really hard to ensure that staff are inviting everybody to the discussion, right? Like this is not a CYFD only discussion placement. It should not be. This is not just CYFD and the tribal representative, right? Like, we really strongly encourage that we have family there, parents, grandparents, and even extended family, even if they cannot be placement, because they can offer other support, right? Like, it's such a powerful meeting when we have everybody at the table. Guardian ad litems are also invited to participate. If the child or the youth is in a treatment foster care setting, that treatment foster care provider and agency are at the table, right? And I don't know if other folks on the call have this experience, but sometimes here, you know, it could be the guardian ad litems that are opposing preferred placement, or it can be a treatment care provider, right? And like, oh no, we can't have visits with grandma because the child is gonna, you know, act out, or right, resort to be harmful behavior, you know. And so the challenge is about, like, they're in a setting where if that happens, like, we're hoping that the providers are able to, like, help provide the tools, right? So that that doesn't happen, and help the family understand the behavior, and you know, be better able to address them. We're not going to not have visits or move to placements out of fear of what could happen, right? Like, let's equip our families, let's equip you know, our extended families who can be support, even if it's outside of placement support. And so the other thing that gets discussed during these out of preferred placement meetings, which is another part of IFPA, is in regards to having and encouraging those cultural connections, right? Like, oftentimes we would hear that, and some of the testimony that tribal representatives shared is just like, oh, well, the child never grew up there, so they don't know, right? They don't know what the culture is. And I know under Governor Riley's administration, he was just like, wonderful. This is a great opportunity to bring them back in and reconnect them to who they are, right? It wasn't an excuse to continue to keep that distance. It was an embrace and an opportunity to bring the child back into the community, and even to bring the family back, right? Like, the family hasn't lived there or even visited in years. Wonderful. This is the opportunity, right? Because again, Creator puts things in our path for a reason. And I think, you know, and one of the things that I have really come to learn and respect, you know, and from Governor Riley is that these, as unfortunate situations as they are, we also have to look at the opportunities that they bring, right, to strengthen our families and our communities. And so that's something within IFPA that, you know, is super important, is those cultural connections. And I'm gonna ask Julie and Jackie to jump in on this, because they do an excellent job about, you know, whose role is it, right? As a state worker, it's not, even being from a tribal community, it's not my job as a state worker to connect the child with their, right? There's roles. And so Julie and Jackie.
Could we, there's a great question in the Q&A. I didn't know if you wanted to answer it. It goes back to the membership discussion. And it says, I saw that the definition of Indian child under New Mexico law did not include a section on being a biological child of a member as one option. Was this a recent change in reference to the pending litigation and race-based concerns, or has this been a consistent definition under New Mexico law?
So I can take that. I know for me, in our experience, it's been a practice in tribal communities. We don't look at barriers to accepting our people, especially our children. A child is a child. And if they are coming from our tribe, we look at them as their own person. And they have that right to be considered a member without any ties. So they were blessed. We were blessed with their life. and to look at ties that would have an impact on their tribal community accepting them because of what the government says should be considered a member. That's not how we operate in tribal communities. A human is a human, a child is a child, and they were put here for a reason. And their home is their tribe. Their tribe is going to accept, embrace, love, and teach them the way that they were intended to by being blessed on this earth. And we look at them as their own person. So I don't know if that is going to answer the question, but that's how we see our Indian children, as their own.
Thanks, Jackie. And I just want to add to, like, ICWA is not about race, right? Like ICWA tribes, we tribal people, it's we have it's a political status, right? And so that's what that was the intent that was the intent behind that. And I know we have just a few minutes left, but I really did want Julie and Jackie to touch on the cultural connections piece.
So I know you heard me earlier mention about cultural compacts. That is a section in the Indian Family Protection Act. You know, when we are notified as a tribe that we have a possible ICWA case, once it's been determined, we start that conversation about cultural connection immediately. Not even if it's just making the contact with the state worker who's been working with our child. We make that mention, we let it be known as the tribe that, you know, we want to ensure that our child knows who they are with Nambe Pueblo. We also want to ensure that our child gets all the supports that can be afforded to him or her in their connection with Nambe Pueblo. And whatever that looks like, you know, we need your support and your assistance in doing that. And those discussions have really just blossomed some really great relationships with the Pueblo of Nambe. For instance, I had a young person in Colorado who he's in his preteen, well, he's a teenager, and had no idea he was Native, much less from the Pueblo of Nambe. And this young man was so eager to know that while he was excited, he was able to know and confirm that he was Native. And once he knew the tribe he came from, which was Nambe, he just really wanted to connect, wanted to do everything possible to know who Nambe was, what Nambe was about, you know, and he just really gravitated to knowing that he is a member of Nambe Pueblo. And the thing he shared with me was he felt like he was lost and he just couldn't find where he fit in. And it gets me all kind of emotional because he was even placed with relatives and he still felt an emptiness. And he said, I feel like I know where I'm going now. And, you know, even to hear that coming out of a young person who, you know, is just trying to find their way and their connections, you know, it's those kind of testimonies from our young people we work with and our families we work with. You hear those kind of words coming out of their mouths and it just resonates with you, you know, it just sits there and it holds a special place in your heart. And so for us, cultural connections is a huge piece of information we relay to any of our partnerships on behalf of any of our children, because Nambe Pueblo, as I shared earlier, does not want to ever feel like they don't know where their children are at, regardless of the outcome. So I don't know, Jackie, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, when we look at culture, always remember that the tribe and the family are going to be those experts in everything culture. No matter how much education you have in Indigenous communities, it's always going to come back to the tribe and the family having that input and always having that input, but that nobody should give them a prefabricated plan or tell them what they need to do when it comes to these connections. Always remembering that each tribe is different in how the cultural practices and traditions are carried out. And we too have our own internal process of how that is carried out. And it cannot be done without the support of the community and the tribe itself for those to be carried out for the family. And it should not, and it should never be at the responsibility of a non-tribal worker because they're not part of that community and don't understand the way that that is intended to be carried out and the sacredness that goes behind it. And that's the key, is the sacredness and the value that all of the tribes hold near and dear within to make sure that those practices and the tribals' customs and traditions are always protected and honored.
Great. Thank you, Julie and Jackie. I think one of the things that was really powerful in hearing the testimonies around culture and making those connections, was when Native children are adopted outside of family, outside of their communities, right? Like children here will keep you connected. Tribes here will keep them connected, right? And here in New Mexico, that wasn't happening. And so the tribes felt it was really important that that it wasn't just lip service anymore, right? And so anytime a guardianship or an adoption is finalized to a non-family or a non-tribal member from the child's tribe, that cultural compact will be part of the finalization of that guardianship and that adoption. So I think that's just, and the tribe creates it. It's not, we're not going to create a form. We're not going to westernize that process in any way, right? Like this is something that's coming from the tribe. This is how we want, if we're allowing you, right, as a non-family member to this child, as a non-tribal member from our tribe, if we're allowing you to adopt our child or be caretakers for our child, this is what you need to do, what we need you to do to keep our child connected to who he or she is. Thank you very much.
I thank you all. I'm looking at the time, but I just really want to say, thank you so much for taking so much out of your time for these last 3 webinars that we did. I know it was a lot of information. On purpose, we scheduled it an hour because we just knew that there was so much, but we didn't want to try to cut into, but I'm feeling like this one I feel like we may be able to even continue to talk or take a deeper dive into how this legislation was created, perhaps inviting some of the partners that you indicated into this conversation to share their perspective as to why they got involved and what that work looked like. So I would encourage you, those that are still hanging on, because I know we're past the hour, to include that in your evaluation. If you want to hear more about this and take a deeper dive, let's do it. We would love to honor that for you. Again, thank you to all the participants. Thank you, Julie, Jackie, Donalyn, Angela, and Esther, also for your assistance in this. May you all have a wonderful day, and again, have ease. Thank you.